Gardening is universal. No matter where we live, what we grow, or how we garden, we share the same instinct to nurture something and watch it flourish. With more than 3 decades in the garden industry, Paul Zimmerman explores the passion that connects gardeners around the world with those who also live in it. Drawing on years of travel, conversations with international growers and hobby gardeners, and countless visits leading garden tours everywhere from France to England to New Zealand, Paul looks beyond the how-to and dives into the deeper questions. Why do we garden? What's changing in the gardening world? And what does it reveal about who we are? Please welcome your host, Paul Zimmerman.
Welcome to my World of Gardening podcast. Hope you enjoy this one. Our guest is John Ford, who I've known for quite a while, a breeder from New Zealand. So we'll be talking to John in a little bit. But before then, a piece that we're calling Paul's Journal, just some reflections on my garden and gardens in general. We have rain. You've heard me talk about it, if you've heard me write about it, if you get my newsletter, that we've had a drought here. And the interesting thing, now that we're getting these heavy rains, is I'm actually getting a better peak bloom now than I do in late April, which is my normal peak bloom. So I really didn't think I was going to get a spring flowering, and boom! The rains came, and the roses and all the plants woke up. My Acephalus is full bloom, waiting for monarch butterflies to show up. So I am just really, really happy that all this rain is coming down. Of course, the weeds are also coming back, but that's okay. I had weeded before the rain just to make sure all the water went to the plants, but just really grateful for this rain and happy to see it. And the plants are as well, because we can irrigate, we can water by hand, but as we all know, there's nothing like rain. Had a good couple weeks since we talked last, my last podcast. Sent some cuttings from some roses to be offered through Jackson & Perkins, some things I've had for a while. A couple I'm really excited about. Purezza. If you don't know Purezza, it's a wonderful little story. It's a repeat blooming white lady banks, the double form of lady banks. It was discovered in the Finesci garden in Italy, and it does not grow as big as lady banks, probably because it repeats. That does seem to keep the ramblers that repeat a little bit smaller. But it is a lovely little white rose. I doesn't say it flowers all the time. It's more of a repeat flowering or intermittent flowering, I guess is the word that I'm looking for. But it's a charming rose. I sent cuttings of that to be offered through Jackson & Perkins. Also some roses from Peter Beals that I've had in my garden for probably 20 years. Rural England, Festive Jewel, and the rose, Ivor's rose, also known as Flamenco rosita in this country. Rural England is lovely. It's like a heavily flowering, repeating Dorothy Perkins. It's on the one I put on the maypoles at the Biltmore garden, rose garden, a number of years ago. They had actually shown me some hand-colored painted tints for that. I think Cornelia Vanderbilt did, the daughter of George and Edith Vanderbilt. And they showed us pink rose with small flowers, and I thought, well, that has to be Dorothy Perkins. That was popular back at the time. The era is good. Dorothy Perkins, introduced by Jackson Perkins, by the way. So I thought, well, rather than do Dorothy Perkins, let's find something that's like Dorothy Perkins but repeats. And that's where we came up with Rural England, which I had just gotten from Peter. So I thought that was a wonderful thing. And that's one of the wonderful challenges I love about designing gardens or going back and recreating historic gardens in the case of the Biltmore, is saying, okay, where can I honor the past but bring in the present and update things a little bit? And there's another garden that I just recently finished designing for a client in Michigan. Lovely, lovely people. They use it as a wedding venue and events venue, among other things. Large piece of property. They had some things scattered around, and they had the venue where the bride and groom come in well defined, but then she loves roses, loves to collect all different kinds of roses. Sounds familiar. We're all in that same boat. So the key was, how do I make this garden cohesive? And what I did was I created a ramble. It's a walkway that basically does a circle around the entire piece of property, and it encompasses the wedding area as well. And then I planted island beds, just island beds among the lawn, and each bed then is themed by color. So as you're looking at the garden, on the left-hand side, the colors are kind of like yellows and apricots, and then pinks and whites and blues across the top, because that's what you see when you're looking at the bride and groom being married, essentially. So I thought, let's keep that kind of pastel-y and soft so it goes with whatever the theme of the wedding may be. And then oranges and reds are on the right. And then she had 26 Korean lilacs, which are not a plant I'm familiar with, but I looked them up. So the lilac gets about 5 or 6 feet high. So I put 13 on either side of a path in a bunch. So you're walking through like a short lilac woods, I guess is the best way I can describe it. So again, the fun part about designing gardens, either an old garden like Biltmore, honoring the past, bringing in the present, or in this particular case, creating a place from scratch and saying, what a wonderful ramble, a place to walk through. So it's, again, some of the aspects of designing gardens that I love doing. And if you need some help with your garden, give me a holler, particularly if you're a rose collector and not quite sure how to tie it all together. I seem to get a lot of that. Another rose I sent off this week was New Hampshire State House. I sent cuttings of that to Matt Douglas at High Country Roses, my good friend Matt. New Hampshire State House was bred by the late Mike Lowe, lived up in New Hampshire, Nashua, New Hampshire. Mike died in 2009, too soon. It's a lovely soft pink rose. There's a video of it on my YouTube channel if you want to go look at it. A rose you should know. It's a short is essentially what it is, also on my Facebook group page. Mike was a breeder, a photographer, and particularly a collector of old roses. He had an amazing collection of old garden roses all the way back to Gallicas, hybrid perpetuals, bourbons, centifolias, damas, alba species. I mean, it was probably one of the better collections in the United States. And he and I became friends, and then he basically was the foundation or the beginning of the plant material for Ashdown roses. That's how I got to know Mike. So I'm always grateful for Mike for his generosity in contributing to getting Ashdown roses on its feet with that remarkable collection that he allowed me really just free access to. I remember driving up in my Dodge Dually pickup truck up to Nashua, New Hampshire from South Carolina here. And I'm sure a Dodge Dually in Nashua, New Hampshire with South Carolina plates probably scared a lot of people. But I had coolers, filled them with cuttings, and brought them back. And that was the beginning of Ashdown roses. So I want to make sure this rose stays in Commerce, New Hampshire State House. I may have the only plant around, and Matt's the perfect person. Cold hardy climbing rose, and Matt at High Country Roses in Denver, Colorado is the guy. So get on the waiting list with Matt and make sure you grab one of these things. It's a really lovely rose. Big news is, Monday, I'm off to France. I have a garden tour that I'm leading in the Lyon area, doing some business for Jackson and Perkins, hunting down new roses for you folks. I have a design client in Perpignan, France, the Chateau La Tour Alpinière, and there's a series of videos on my YouTube channel about that program. Lovely American couple purchased the chateau, got a hold of me, and they said, we need to redo the garden. We're not really sure where to begin, and that's how I got involved. I went for the first time last year, loved the town, charming town. The chateau is half a mile. It's actually in the village. It's not don't think of like a huge chateau with acres and acres and acres. And it was just a lovely time, so I get to go back there and spend some time. And then I finish more business at Peterbilt's Roses for Jackson and Perkins. And always excited to go back to Peterbilt's Roses. Peter, of course, passed away, but Ian Limmer is still there, who was there when Peter was there. In fact, he started with Peter when he was a young man. So looking forward to going back to Peterbilt's Roses and the town of Attleboro. I'll be staying at the Mulberry Tree, and I will hoist a pint for Peter. So now it's time for our guest, John Ford. Learned how to breed roses from his aunt, Nola Simpson, in New Zealand. That's where John resides, and that's where Aunt Nola Simpson lived as well. Introduced some fairly well-known roses, and you'll hear John talk about that. He is a plant breeder by profession, and we'll touch on that as well. I met John about 10 years ago, I'm going to say. He wanted to get his roses into America, and he happened to be in this country on his professional plant breeding business, and he reached out to me, and he said, I've heard that you can help with this, and I said, yes, I can. I had just started my relationship with Jackson and Perkins, and one of the things I thought, and one of the things that was in discussion was, perhaps this is a way to bring new genetics into Jackson Perkins. And that's how it all began. So I talked to Jackson Perkins, connected with John, and that's how this all started. And that's how John's roses are now at Jackson and Perkins, with a lot more to come. So I'm done with Paul's Journal. So let's go meet John. So you were talking earlier, it was interesting about breeding roses, and your goal is always to breed something different and something new. Is that correct?
Yeah, so my whole philosophy on breeding roses was the big boys in the game, they hold the market share. For an amateur or a new breeder, you got to do something totally different. And whether it's color or form or whatever in a rose, it's got to be something different that is different to what the professionals are actually doing. And so that was my goal when I started breeding, was looking at different colours and different forms of roses. And sometimes different form in a rose can be a modern hybrid tea, which tends to be phased out by a lot of the modern breeders today. So that's a novelty in itself and not something that's too dominant on the market.
So you talked about as well, you said, you were an amateur breeder. You now have roses in commerce. So I don't know if we can call you quote unquote an amateur anymore. But did you feel more pressure to do something novel because nobody really knew who you were?
Yeah.
To make your mark, I guess is the word that I'm looking for.
Yes, the background for my breeding follows a family member and a very close aunt of mine. And
It was Nola Simpson.
yes.
Yeah.
And so she helped train me up, and the two of us worked as a team. And it was always the aim to be able to be competitive is you've got to produce something novel. And that starts off, the most novel thing that a breeder can do is actually try to change colours and mix colours up to where you can get them. And I think Edward LaGrice as a breeder was somebody who was known for producing novelty in the 60s and early 70s. And so I wanted to follow something like him. And I also wanted to follow a breeder by the name of Herbert Swim, who was a famous breeder in the US who didn't do always the highest number of crosses and produce the most roses, but he actually produced some really outstanding roses, and they were released in the world. And he was the only breeder that's actually been able to stop and start breeding and start again with different companies and so forth himself. So great admiration for both those breeders, Herbert and Edward LaGrice. And with training with my aunt and working with her, that's how I got into breeding and looking for novelty.
Do you think Becca Nola was your aunt? Correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't Sam McGreedy call her one of the best amateur breeders out there? There was a quote that was considered Sam. Right?
Yeah, he reckons Nola was, well, definitely the best female breeder,
Yeah.
but also the very best amateur breeder he had ever met, and probably goes right back to very early breeders of the turn of the century of the 20th century. And he had great admiration because she brought the first chocolate brown to market in New Zealand with a rose called Hot Chocolate.
Yes.
And which was a very popular rose in New Zealand and has been in other parts of the world too.
That's high praise coming from Sam. I mean, Sam pretty much developed a hand-painted series, which were different as well. You started breeding young with your Aunt Nola, and obviously she had her own breeding lines as well. Did you feel that you needed to continue her lines, or do you feel that you needed to take what she had done and put your own stamp on it?
Yeah, firstly, I did use a lot of her lines, and I tried to follow her for a little while. But then I had to do something different that was for me. And one of the big things in roses that maybe the roses of Nola's time were that we had to improve the health. So we had a lot of colour, a lot of form, including exceptional colours coming through. But the health was not always
And
the
this
very
would have
best.
been when? 80s, 90s?
This would have been in the 90s period,
Yeah, just put
early
some-
2000s.
Yeah, just put some context around it. Yeah.
So I introduced some other, and usually the Persica rose was where I went for looking for a bit of health, but I took a different strategy around. I was not always into shrubby type roses. I wanted something that was more of a traditional rose form in terms of the plant and habit. So quite structured and not something that was going to be rampant. And so that's how I've developed or tried to develop healthy roses that are free flowering and then bringing in the novelty around where they are.
Yeah, so the novelty would also then be the color and the form. And now you mentioned as well that, you didn't want shrubs that were rampant. So are you intentionally breeding to get plants that are a little more compact or a little more polite might be another word for it.
Yeah, polite is what it is. So more of a traditional shape plant, what we would have been used to in the 80s and 90s of a plant,
This is more the
but a lot healthier.
traditional hybrid T shape, more
Yeah.
floribunda shape, rounded shrub, more upright shrub,
Very much
opposed to
a
the giant
floribunda.
sprawling, some of the old garden roses can certainly sprawl. And some of the David Austins are also sprawlers, but they can get rather large.
Yeah, I like roses that show the flower, that the flower's not drooping down too much, that can stand the weather and has got good colour appeal, free flowering, and if it's a hybrid tea or a floribunda or a shrub, it's quite structured as a plant.
It makes a nice looking plant as opposed to just, something that's just kind of all over the place, which in a wild setting might work, or a prairie style garden. But in most people's gardens, and gardens are getting smaller, they want something that they can at least control, I guess is probably a good word, not get out of hand.
And definitely, Paul, in New Zealand, we have smaller sections now. So gardens a lot smaller. People grow a lot of stuff in pots. They have small areas. So they've got to be something that you're not going to trip over if you're going around your garden. So those real shrubby wild beast plants just don't fit that role. And that's what I have aimed to breed, is plants that actually fit a mold that can be suited to a smaller garden, but also are very good in an ordinary big garden and blend in with both plants and in a straight rose garden.
Well, the nice thing too about when you have a shrub like that, like you talked about, if you do have a slightly larger space, you can plant more than one. You can plant 3 of the same variety or 5 of the same variety and end up getting, a larger area covered. But again, it's not going to come over and, become a house eater.
Correct.
Yeah.
And I trim some of my roses with just a hedge trimmer, and I want to be able to do that. So at times, and I've even taken to some with a chainsaw.
Yeah, that's radical.
But they're not overly vigorous, but it is a way of tidying them up and actually seeing how they recover. So
that's interesting. So I want to back up to that a minute. So seeing how they recover, are you looking from a breeding standpoint to see how they recover? And then what are you looking for?
So it's both a breeding point, but also recovery of a rose if it gets disease or too overgrown and you actually hack it back to something that's a lot lower. Will it actually come away again and actually still produce the goods in terms of flower, etc.? And so you've got to be mindful of some of these things. Not every rose is going to do that, but you've got to take that into account with some of the breeding lines that I've got. And there's 1 or 2 in the future that will come through. Rising Sun is a rose that you can hack back and it'll come away in flower and it doesn't need spraying.
So we're going to end up with the John Ford chainsaw line of roses.
Well, you could do. I wouldn't like to publicize that, Paul.
It's too late now, John. It's on the podcast. Okay, so, and you were talking about earlier, you talked about in New Zealand, gardens are getting smaller, America, they're getting smaller. So talk a little bit about your profession that you do as well, which is plant breeding, which kind of began to take you around the world. Would I be correct in saying that?
Yes.
Yeah. And tell a little bit about, just so people who don't know that, what is your professional breeding life, I should say, besides roses, obviously, but.
So I'm a plant breeder of forage grasses and legumes. So it's taken me around the world. I'm currently doing breeding projects in the US and tall fescue and ryegrass and red clover in particular. But I've done this in Europe with white clover for big companies over there. And my varieties for the company I work with have gone global. So I must be doing something okay.
Yeah, well, your roses are global, so obviously you're doing okay on a lot of different levels. So I want to talk now about, and I'm using that as a segue to get into. So now you're traveling more for your professional breeding capacity. I don't, not the word I want to use. You're traveling for the forage breeding capacity, because the roses are also your professional breeding capacity, and we want to make sure that's clear. So as you began to travel to other countries and look at other roses, which obviously I'm guessing you probably were looking at rose gardens while you were traveling, did that change your breeding program at all?
It enlightened me a lot more, in particular with Europe and continental Europe and France, probably the main part of that, and involvement with Mayon. And I saw roses in a different perspective too. We traditionally had got roses from the UK that were bred pretty much for that environment and quite a traditional look. And the French rose itself gave me a different perspective and what you needed to do as a rose breeder to actually, if you were to market globally, don't just look at one type of rose. You needed to look at variation in different types. So you need to be open in developing roses that can adapt to different environments, but also suit those environments that you potentially could market in.
So the range then of what you see in the European breeders what you began to see was not only the range of the roses, but the range of growth habits, the range of bloom style. Am I pretty much accurate on that aspect as well?
Very much so.
Yeah. So you said, okay, now we're going to not get away from the traditional hybrid tea Florimunda, but I'm going to start adding other kinds of rose material into that.
Correct.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, which they do. And you and I were talking at lunch about French roses, and it's kind of, I always like to ask people this, because I get asked a lot too, and you do too, what is a French rose? And I think our response both at lunch was, well, you just know it when you see it. To me, there's a romance about the French roses that you don't really capture. It's different from the English roses. It's not better, just different.
It is, and it's very hard to actually describe what that is, as you say.
Yeah.
Usually they can be fragrant, they can have a form that is, and I call my breeding now, where I've tried to introduce the French rose like modern multi-petaled roses. They don't have a set number. They've just got a romance and a bit of moisture on them. They look something that's just luscious. And so I think we as breeders have got to keep your eyes open to actually introduce some of that into your own breeding pools to be able to help maybe work in those markets, but also it gives you variation in your gene pool. And that's most important when you're a breeder. We can become very insular and just work with our own genetics and get very focused on that and not keep our eye open for diversity. And diversity in any breeding program is the number one tool that a breeder should always work for and look for is diversity.
Well, you want to keep building on what you started before. You don't want to say, okay, I've released, the quintessential red hybrid tea. Now I'm going to release the quintessential white hybrid tea. Now the pink one, now the mauve one. And then next year I'll do another red one, which hopefully will be better than the other red one. You want to expand the look and the lines, like you said, and constantly looking for something new. And that's where the new genetics come in.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like you just don't want the same style of plant either. You want a plant that can be different with a red rose, not always have everything standing up perfect and the flower. There's so much variation out there that we can get. So why not have a red rose that is more of a shrubby or have more flowers or smaller flowers or single flowers or whatever. And the scope is enormous, but I don't know if we've actually covered all that. Certainly in recent times, and a lot of the breeding today can be everything looks very much the same, maybe slightly different color variation, but the diversity is not always there. And that's a challenge for a breeder. And that's one of the number one things that I aim for is something that's got to be different, that's not on the market, and can potentially be something that takes off and can be a pleasure for all the other people that grow it, because that's why we grow roses.
Yeah, well, if you look at roses traditionally in traditional form, I always tell people say, well, I don't like single roses. And I always say, well, the traditional original species roses, for the most part, were single.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the modern hybrid tea is actually something really, well, I mean, if you could argue La France was potentially the first hybrid tea, but really Peace was the rose that sort of ushered in that class. And that was it 1946, 1947. So it hasn't been around that long. And you go back to the diversity of the old garden roses, the Gallicas and the Centifolias, even the Chinas. I mean, the diversity of form was huge. And so do you as a breeder, do you find it exciting that we seem to be getting back into that broad and embracing the broad diversity of the flower that is the rose, which is infinite in its varieties?
Yeah, very much so. And I can say that I have developed as a rose person that I didn't like single roses, Paul.
No,
And I
John.
didn't even like semi-doubles.
Yeah.
But and I didn't like some of the harsh pinks. But now my mind is more open and I like all types of roses and they all have a place in gardens. And yes, we all have particular tastes and some, but there's a bigger world out there.
Well,
And
roses are so diverse in what you can use them for. If you stop and think about it, if you're looking at it from a landscape design standpoint or something like that, I love this. I love the singles. I've always loved the singles. I've never not liked them. And I like in more of a casual type setting with other perennials and herbaceous perennials because they lend a wildness to the garden, I guess is what I'm looking at. But then you can also have the modern rose, which my wife loves to cut and bring in the house, which I'm sure, you talk about Chris, your wife being in a floral art. So, I mean, she must be loving, embracing all these different kind of varieties that you have in your own garden.
she does. She
Yeah.
does. She likes the color range, but the forms all have a play in in the garden, and so she's used everything from singles and different colors right through to traditional hybrid teas, but also the multi-petal versions.
Yeah, and you can have a rose garden all of a sudden now that where they don't all necessarily look alike. You've got this great diversity within this one genus of plant, which is remarkably, a lot of the other genuses there are variations, but not to me at least, not as much as there are in roses. Not that I'm biased, and you either, I would think.
No.
Let me ask you a question. I want to go back to your profession. You talk, you breed forage plants that was your husband, your career all your life. You know a lot of rose breeders. They really only breed roses necessarily. There are breeders who breed other plant material. I get that. But do you think your career being breeding forage plants, do you think that gave you a different focus or a different approach than maybe some other rose breeders would have taken?
Maybe. It's quite hard to say. I found that a lot of breeders in the profession I'm in look at single traits usually and have an eye for usually one or two things. And so their pattern of breeding is aimed for that. And I suppose what that for me was a negative and gave me the challenge to go and do something quite different and not try to do something that somebody else was doing, that you had to look at the game as a bigger picture. And people are very visual. They're very visual. The first instinct, whether it's a farmer looking at a grass or a clover, or whether it's a gardener looking at a flower or a plant, we instantly either want it or we're not quite so
That's a
interested.
very good point. Yeah.
And so all those things actually have helped me to try to, what would I want if I was a gardener or a farmer or whatever, and whatever thing that I was going to use it for. And I think that's where you come about. If you want a rose that's a landscape rose, you want something that's going to attract insect life. You're looking for single roses, probably more. If it's got fragrance, that's an added advantage. If it's got health, that's even bigger again. If you can bring those things together, that's great. But then you might have somebody. I love traditional hybrid teas. That's what really got me into roses in the first place. As a small boy, I loved the hybrid tea rose. That's what attracted me. I love breeding them, but they're the hardest roses to breed. To actually get a really good hybrid tea with good form and now color diversity and good health, the hardest things for a breeder to do and the biggest challenge. How many breeders are actually doing that today, Paul?
That's true. Well, then with the hybrid tea and the demand nowadays, you not only got the form of the hybrid tea, which is a very specific form. There's not a lot of variation in the form of a classic hybrid tea rose. And you talked about you want to bring in health and you want to bring in vigor. And oh, by the way, let's toss in fragrance.
Yeah,
Yeah. I mean, now, that's probably the goal of everyone, I guess, to get into that aspect of it.
correct.
Yeah.
And that is makes the mission real, real hard to try to bring all those factors together. And one day we'll be lucky and have everything.
I hope not.
But that'll take away the challenge if you do get something that's the ultimate. But that's the challenge of breeding, is try to get the ultimate.
But that to me would also take away the variations of what is nature.
Correct. And that's
nature's not perfect.
no.
And I think when the rose world, I talked about this at lunch a little as well. We've gotten on the track in the rose world of the rose has to be perfect at all times. And people aren't perfect. Roses aren't perfect. Plants aren't perfect. Forage grasses aren't perfect. So, maybe we need to take the pressure off the rose a little bit and just embrace the diversity. And if it's not so perfect, that's okay too.
And I think to a large degree, we've got a certain amount of diversity in our breeders who are doing, maybe the breeders doing the same type of thing, but there's enough breeders around that are giving us a certain amount of diversity. And I think as a breeder, you've got to acknowledge that, but also you've got to, look at it as a possibility to adding to your own breeding program to actually encourage and try to bring more diversity to your own material as well, not just have a specific type. And that's what I've tried to do, is breed roses that are there for everyone, because I'm a gardener. I love my garden, and I'm looking for something different all the time. And so that's what I'm breeding for, is something different that I can be passionate about. And it might change every 5 minutes, because I breed something and I like it for 2 or 3 years, and then I like something else better. And that's what keeps me going and the passion going, is because we haven't really touched all that's available there. And so there's a zest to be able to produce more and more of a wider range of roses and plants.
Well, and I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. You're a gardener first and foremost who happens to breed roses. And so you're coming at it from a gardener's eye. I think sometimes for some breeders, it can almost become, there's a danger, and I have this sometimes with myself, of gardening becoming your profession too much. And you lose that original connection of what made you a gardener in the first place. And it sounds like you have maintained that connection in your roses. You look at them, yes, you look at it from the breeder standpoint, does it have this character? But you just said, you look at it from a gardener standpoint.
Correct. I probably wouldn't be breeding if it was just a job to earn a bit of money. Mine is the passion to actually produce something that I really love and like in the garden, whether it's in a rose bed, whether it's picking, or whether it's sniffing, or what. It's got to be something that appeals and that I'm passionate about. I throw out so many seedlings and bits and pieces that other people like, but if I don't like it, I've got no passion for that particular rose.
Well, and if you don't like it, it's not a John Ford rose.
Correct.
Yeah.
It's got to fit my eye
Yeah.
and my standards to actually be a rose that I am proud to actually say and could give to somebody and be confident that they hopefully will get the same enjoyment out of it that I have had out of it.
Yeah, and the great breeders that I've met over the years, and I've been fortunate in that sense of the word, they do have not a singular vision, because that's not the word I'd use. They have a vision for what they want. And like you said, it can change from time to time. There's nothing wrong with that. But they know, this is a John Ford rose. This is not a John Ford rose. And they just know that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
and I would love that, Paul. I would love to have something where people could say, this has come out of John Ford's stable of breeding. That would be something that would just be of high super value for me.
Well, it'll come. I mean, your rose line is focused. I mean, that's what I liked about it when I was in New Zealand a couple of years ago and had a chance to visit your breeding program. I loved the uniqueness of some of what I was seeing, and in color and form, in growth habit, and looking at it and saying, how would I use that in the garden? There were some things that would just set a lot of your roses apart from everything else.
And I think when I've had other breeders around and looked at the garden, they always say that there's something different in there to what they've got. And some of them would like to have their hands on some of that stuff.
It's the highest compliment you can ever get.
Yeah.
And you won't give it to them anyway, because you don't say, no, those are mine.
Not until it's on the market.
That's on the market. Then it's open pollen at that point in time on the market.
But then I would be exactly the same, Paul. If I go to another breeder's, there's always roses in their pool of material that I would say I would really like that. I would give a finger for that.
Yeah. That again points back to what we talked about earlier, the diversity of roses.
Correct.
Yeah, there's something that we all like. So I want to ask you one last question, and this could, I don't know, you can think about it and see what you want to do with it. So you started breeding roses under Nola, your aunt, Nola Simpson. If Nola Simpson today could look at John Ford's breeding roses, what do you think she'd say?
I would like to think that she would be very proud. It's a bit emotional. She was a special lady in my life, and I've had great support from my family to follow a passion. But I think she would look down and she would say, I think you've done a good job. I think I'd be proud of you for what you and how you've focused on your breeding. And you've taken it to a step beyond maybe where she was. And so I can sometimes feel that and feel that she's on my shoulders and giving me inspiration.
John, thank you so much for joining me on the World of Gardening podcast. And I know everyone who listens is looking forward to your roses around the world.
Thank you, Paul. Very much appreciated.